Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. Here with us to discuss pathogen surveillance and the most objective way to measure is Dr. David Baum of Iowa State University's Diagnostic Laboratory in Ames, Iowa. Welcome, Dr. Baum. Thank you for being with us today.
Happy to be here, Sarah. Thank you.
For those of you that are joining us here online, we thank you for taking the time to tune in. If you have any questions, feel free to post those there in the chat area on your screen. If you're joining us from social media, simply post your questions directly in those channels. I also want to make a note that Dr. Baum's and your colleagues had an article for us that is in our January issue of Feedstuff. So be sure to check that out. It should be in your email mailbox or on feedstuffs.com. You can access it there. So why don't you start us off by telling us a little bit about your work there at Iowa State and why it's important for the hog industry?
Sure. What I'm going to describe today is what I call an objective way to be able to describe the health status of a population of pigs using a particular ELISA test. What that means is that we're using antibody detection to characterize that pathogen status within the population. Oftentimes, practitioners look at only the qualitative results, positive, negative, or suspect, to assess a given population of pigs. What my colleagues and I have discovered is that there makes great sense to be looking at the quantitative values from ELISA tests, because those lend themselves to statistical analysis of the data. And if we incorporate the most recent set of data in with the historical data that have been collected from populations, practitioners will be able to interpret the recent results in light of that herd's history. So that's the intent of what we're doing today.
And why is that important to the industry?
It's important to the industry so that they can understand when a pathogen is truly a problem in a herd, or if what they are seeing is simply what are known as nonspecific reactors due to the nature of the test. This is particularly important for herds that bring in replacement livestock with defined pathogen characteristics, meaning defined negative. So it's nice to know what negative actually looks like with regards to the quantitative test results. And I think that if there is wisdom used in understanding these results, one might see a way to be able to reduce the necessity for repeated testing or even euthanasia of animals and additional samples being sent, or even the cessation of a load of breeding stock that had been scheduled to be sold pending the results of the health testing. So I think what we're going to show you will be how to understand those results, and also to show you what a pathogen negative herd or population of animals looks like.
Yeah, you've got some slides to share with us here today. So why don't we go ahead? There they are.
All right. So the first few slides that you're going to see are the surveillance data from one herd over the course of several years. And this is a statistical process control chart, and an SPC chart contains always two parts. It contains a chart of the average or X bar values from each population's sample sets collected each month, and then also the range value of each of those sample sets. So in this farm, we just first I want to show you what the thought pattern is in looking at these charts. And we first begin by calculating the averages and the ranges within a sample set for the entire data set. And that explains why the data points for both of these graphs are either on one side or the other of the average, or they're just seemingly senseless because of the way that the limits were calculated for every sample set. Already, I think you can see that there look to be two different regions of data. There is one located right here, then there's another distribution of data located here in the X bar, and then also in the range data. And then that falls down precipitously after a certain point. So that suggests that we probably need to be looking at recalculating the averages and limits for 3 different data sets. And so these are the results, and the interpretation of those data are that the herd had been diagnosed with mycoplasma during these 4 data points and even before that, and decided that they wanted to eliminate the pathogen in order to be able to sell pathogen negative replacements later on. So whatever the pathogen elimination practice was, it appeared to result in an increase in the exposure, which led to an increase in infection of the remaining of the population of sows that were on this farm. And then, this is January of 2017, then a significant process change happened. And the process change was that the infected population of females was depopulated and repopulated with what were expected to be pathogen negative replacements. And over the course of the next several years, it appears that the expectation of those replacement animals being negative was correct. And I'm making that conclusion based on the X bar R chart above and the average value of each set of samples that came from the farm into the diagnostic lab over these years. The positive suspect cutoff for this assay, it has an S to P of 0.4 or greater. So that means with an average S to P value right there at just about 0.1, that is well below the average S to P value for what would be considered to be positive by the kit manufacturer. And over the course of the remaining years, the average S to P value remains low and continues to drop. You'll see some occasional out of bounds signals in these data. I think we account for that simply by the variation that is innate with populations and the innate variation that happens from sample set to sample set. And at no time did the average S to P value ever become positive. So my conclusion, our conclusion of this population's pathogen status is that it's negative. But you might say, oh, Dr. Baum, what about those things down at the bottom? I said, those things down at the bottom are pretty interesting. And this is where I think there's tremendous value in looking at graphing of the S to P values. Because you will see that these red values are just at the positive and negative, positive suspect cutoff values. And in the area from here to right about there, the proportion of the positives, we'll call them positives because the S to P values were high enough to be considered positive, that the prevalence of those is well within the expected value of 0.98 plus or minus however many percentage points for the diagnostic test's specificity. But Dr. Baum, what about this dude up here? You know what? We get those on occasions where we get miscreant samples that just throw unusually loud results from an ELISA. In those instances, it does make sense for that sample to be retested immediately. But notice that even that value had no impact on the average S to P value at that sample. So my conclusion from this is that the population was repopulated with believed to be negative um, females in January of 2017 and has remained negative since that time, with the expected level of nonspecific reactors happening throughout this time. For hex and giggles, I went back to look at the pre-outbreak S to P values, and we can see that over on the left-hand side, yep, there was something going on right about here. And this is the time period when the infection was diagnosed. This is the time period again where the population's pathogen reduction strategy was put into place. And then again, we see the point in time where the sows were depopulated and repopulated. These are data from another sow farm that had also been producing pathogen negative animals for several months, years up until, I can't read that, there we go, November-ish, December-ish of 2022. And then an outbreak of the pathogen occurred again. The same strategy was used to control the infection, I was told, and we see evidence then of what we call an antibody kinetic curve happening in this population, which corresponds with perhaps the intentional infection of the animals with the pathogen here, or maybe even herd closure, and then an anamnestic response of that population during that closure. Need to bring that to your attention too, back in that first population. What we're seeing here, again, is probably the original antibody kinetic response following initial infection, and then a booster and then another booster dose as a result of the control strategy that was implemented. So this is another thing that differentiates an infection from a nonspecific reactor. That's the presence of this antibody kinetic curve in the population. And you only get to see that, colleagues, if you have regular collection of surveillance samples and then regular analysis and charting of those sample test results. Now we're back to that second farm, again looking at what probably is the initial antibody kinetic curve from the infection, and then the strategy to eliminate / reduce the population, or reduce the pathogen from the population / eradicate it. But you'll notice here that while there is hope that the pathogen has been eliminated, there still may be residual organism in the population that is circulating and producing this sort of a antibody kinetic curve. And the same concern is borne on the range chart of the data during that same time period. What about this one, Dr. Baum? Well, I'm thinking that's just one of those miscreant samples that really lit up the test and should be retested immediately. And in most cases, it's going to come back negative. And now we have another population of animals where the same things were experienced with a shorter history. The values that are on the pathogen ELISA at this time are largely within the variation, are showing a variation that's out of control. And this is something that we see on occasion in populations of females or pigs. This does not look like an antibody kinetic curve. I think we would all agree with that, but something from outside the population has been introduced into the population that produces a nonspecific reaction on this ELISA. The possibility of that is further borne out, I believe, by the range values. So back here, I would be inclined to call the population negative, but I would sure advise clients to be thinking about what sorts of things are being done to the pigs on or about the time that the samples are collected. Time continues to move on, and boom, we have another antibody kinetic curve. And the decision this time was to simply eliminate that population of animals from the site, and then bring in replacement animals from a negative population. To my understanding, and I will take any questions, that this resulted in the population returning back to negative. And also, whatever was going on back here that produced the nonspecific reactions in this population are occurring in the new population of animals as well. So rather than having our knickers twisted, so to speak, and thinking that these are non-specific or false positive reactions and go look for mycoplasma, I think that's a fool's errand in these cases. I think what needs to be sought for, is what is it that's happening besides an infectious disease process that could contribute to non-specific reactors in a population. So in conclusion, I think this tool is very important for pork producers to be able to understand what the health status based on antibody production is of any population of animals. And it should also foster some tremendous conversations between the sites and their suppliers so that they can understand what the population dynamics of the pathogen antibody results are in both populations. So with that, I think I would love to have questions, if there are any, from if there happen to be any listeners to the presentation.
Oh, there's listeners, but go ahead and post your questions if you all have any. I'm going to have a question though. So you got a lot of valuable information here. Are there any limitations that we need to be aware of when we look at this data? Is there anything that, like, hey, I mean, you said retest if you see some of these kinds of things. Anything else that we should make note of?
Data don't lie. And if they're telling you something about your production system that you think is not true, I think you would do well to ask, what is it that could be producing these non-specific reactors? And this would require things like investigating how different antigens can be introduced into populations of pigs, unbeknownst to even the caregivers. And an antigen doesn't have to be an infectious agent, folks. It can be any protein polysaccharide that is sufficiently large and sufficiently foreign to be able to mount a cross-reactive antibody response. So I think that's it. I'd say don't blow off high values as simply a false positive.
Good point. Now, you are going to be at the Association of American Swine Veterinarians, AASV, here at the end of the month, doing a presentation on this. So I do want to make note of that. We put the link to your Feedstuffs article in the chat there if anyone wants to go in and check that out. So besides those two places, is there anywhere else that you would recommend that producers go to find out more information or to put some of this into practice on their farm?
Well, if you want to test drive it, Iowa State University's Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory is happy to get you started on trying to explore what this SPC technology will do for you. There's There's no magic to it. All of this can be done easily on spreadsheets. Perhaps the biggest difficulty is in finding the time and the personnel to be able to keep these charts up to date for you. But other than that, if this old guy can do them, I'm sure you all could do it too. As a matter of fact, this method of understanding variation was designed back in 1920, so that the laborers that manufactured relay switches for telephone lines could understand how to best make their relays so that when they were buried, they would last a long time. And these calculations can be done simply with a slide rule, if anybody knows what that is, and an adding machine. Yeah,
I know what that is. I don't know how to use it, but yeah.
Okay.
So what final thoughts would you like to leave our audience with here today? What kind of takeaways, key points would you like them to recall?
Yeah, colleagues, you're sitting on gold mines of diagnostic data, and I think you would do well to look at how it can help you make objective decisions about certain pathogens in populations that you manage, and also to be looking at antibody as a very decent platform. Antibody measurement is a very decent platform to be able to assess health status. And finally, I've heard a criticism that these charts don't do anything. Well, they shouldn't. They're charts. What a chart can help you understand is the behavior of a process for whatever it is that you're measuring, and in this case, pathogens. Now, also get the pushback when they don't see any signals in all of the data that they put together. Well, that means what you're doing is predictable. And if you think it sucks, you can just conclude that it sucks predictably. And it's your job then, as the health advisors and production managers, to figure out what is it that makes it suck the worst.
Good point. I want to thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate you sharing your insight and thoughts on this topic with us.
All right. Glad to be here. Stay
Likewise,
warm.
we want to thank all of you for joining in here today and spending some time with us. A reminder that all Feedstuffs 365 segments are available at feedstuffs.com. Simply go to Feedstuffs 365 in the nav bar and click right there. Until next time, for Feedstuffs 365, I'm Sarah Muirhead.